Professor Ray has a PhD in sociology from Binghamton University, and he also had been the Associate Dean for Curriculum Development at the Culinary Institute of America, so that's a well-known culinary school. As a food studies scholar, he's the author of several books. One, The Migrant's Table, Meals and Memories in Bengali American Households. Has a co-edited volume called Curried Cultures, Globalization, Food, and South Asia. And his most recent book from from Bloomsbury is The Ethnic Restaurateur. And his talk today, titled The Cultural Politics of Taste, will be based on that most recent book. So with that, we welcome Professor Ray to Hofstra, and we're looking forward to hearing what he's going to tell us about ethnic restaurateurs and globalization of food. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks a lot, Sharon. Thank you. Sorry, I have this kind of nasty cold. Welcome. I was wondering why you guys were supposed to be here at 9:25. That's a weird time. But my classes at NYU start at 4:55. It's the funny way that things work. So what I want to talk about today is cultural politics of taste, and a couple of things to think about. I'm going to show you lots of data, and some of it is thin. And some of it is thick. So what you do mostly in anthro, especially in cultural anthro, how many of you are anthro students? Raise your arm. High up. Okay. So you guys, it's probably too early for you to make a decision about your majors. So I'm going to use a little bit of, I'm a sociologist who works with historical material, and I'll show you some data that is cross-sectional and some over time, which is what we call longitudinal. I'm going to talk you are here, supposed to be here until 11. So I'm going to talk for about an hour or less. I'm hoping we're going to get lots of questions and comments. And I will identify some patterns and then do a bit of theorizing. I am a bit of an inductive theorizer, meaning I look at patterns and then I try to explain. I have some concepts in my head and I'll try to explain some of those concepts today. The class I'm teaching at NYU right now, one unit of it, and some of the conversation today is going to be around it, is around this question of suffering and social structure. For instance, if you're interested in agriculture, I heard about sustainability. We read a book, for instance, called Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies, which is written by Seth Holmes, who is both a physician and an anthropologist, who works on, in some ways, how our food system depends on, in fact, literally, the suffering of migrant workers. In this particular case, he talks about, it's a deep ethnographic study, and there are only about 2 million farms in the US, and about 2 million, depending on the season, 2 million farm workers. My work, what I'm going to talk about today almost is on the other side of it. It is more about the political uses of pleasure. Okay, so it's about pleasure and social structure. I'm mostly talking about 500,000 to 1 million people who run restaurants, and about, say, 15 million people who work in restaurants. And it came out of my own questions. I'm an immigrant. I came to the US, and I began to notice that if I went to a restaurant and if I knew something about it, that most of the workers in the kitchen would be immigrant workers. So my question to myself was, is this a recent pattern? Is this kind of a long-term pattern? And so what has changed over time? So the second aspect, the second instigation behind it is an anthropologist, Sidney Mintz. You will hear about him. in a lot of your courses. He wrote one of the defining books on sweetness and power. And if you think about it, in fact, the funny thing about sweetness and sugar in the modern world is that it is deeply entangled with the bitterness of slavery, in fact, in the modern capitalist world. And we wouldn't have cheap sugar without slavery and the oppression of slavery. And Sidney Mitz was the founding, sometimes to be patriarchal, sometimes considered the founding father of anthropology of food specifically, and food studies in general. In an essay, Eating American, he wrote, I do not think that there is such a thing as American cuisine. Kind of, you can think some of this is fighting words, right? And he says he listed pizza, ham, sandwiches, hot dogs, cheese sandwiches, hamburgers, and spaghetti. And he wrote, I don't think anyone wants to call that array cuisine. And and so this question of what is a cuisine and what are its, how do we identify it, how do we name it? The one thing about Mintz's work was that he also said, by the way, not only that Americans don't have a cuisine, national cuisine, he in fact said most people don't have a national cuisine. So he said there is no Chinese cuisine, no Italian cuisine, no French cuisine, which was kind of in some ways shocking to some people. The only authentic cuisine, he says, are by his definition are regional. He linked it to often to watersheds and in fact the relationship between agriculture and food shed. Think about it in a sense. I think about it culturally as if there is a language, there is probably a cuisine. Okay, maybe that's lesson number one for today. Is the relationship between a culture shed, and he argues that one can speak of Bavarian cuisine, not German, Szechuan cuisine, not Chinese, Alsatian, but no French. He says maybe there is New England cuisine, maybe there is Southwest cuisine, but there is no real American cuisine. What really influenced the way Americans think about food and cuisine is, this is a little getting into the historiography of it. Oscar Handlin, a historian, wrote a book, The Uprooted, 1951, and which radically kind of revisioned the way we think about it. He wrote, once I thought to write a history of immigrants in America, then I discovered that immigrants were American history. In fact, this has become the common sense of American historiography today. Prior to that, Americans used to think about the narration of their history as a clash between European settlers and the frontier was imagined as presumably empty space and in some way some engagement with natives and primitives. Both in the old paradigm, which is the idea of the frontier, and even in the new paradigm, post-Handlin, the immigrant, idea of American cuisine, American nation as an immigrant nation, there's an underplaying of certain kinds of culture. And this is maybe point number 2 today, and I'm going to come back to it, this cultural politics of taste, how we come to define national cuisine and regional cuisines. Such a reorientation after Handlin brought into view some of the things that I'm going to talk about today, which is immigrant foodways. But remember, every time you have something coming into view, you will often have something going out of view. When something is foregrounded, something is going to move back, and there's always going to be some gain and some loss, and I'm going to talk about some of that today. So the way I think about this Sidney Mintz question, which is, do Americans have a cuisine? If they have a cuisine, how do they name it? Is it American cuisine? It's regional cuisine. What I find is that Americans, at least in the contemporary world, identify cuisine more with ethnicity, like say Italian food or Chinese food or Indian food. So I started looking at ethnic and national types that are named and consumed by Americans. And I'm particularly interested in questions like, so what are the cuisines that are popular in the in American practice and in American imagination, and what are the cuisines that are prestigious, that have some kind of prestige, and I have to use something as a surrogate for prestige. How do you know prestige when you see it? My argument is maybe I can use price as a surrogate for prestige. Okay. And I'll show you some data, and I'll show you some patterns and how they have changed over time. So the first thing, how many restaurants do you think there are in the United States? If you're going to make a wild guess, how many restaurants? I'm going to ask all these weird questions in the middle of my talk. Yes. 150,000, not bad, but that's at the lower end. Good guess though. It's about a million, right under a million, about 800,000 restaurants. And this is what I mean by kind of knowing the universe of it. And this is relatively thin data, but it is good. You will see what I'm going to do with this thing. And out of which about 500,000 are independent restaurateurs, who are the people I mostly work with, because most of them are in fact immigrant restaurateurs. Okay, and there are about 300,000 chain restaurants. I revealed the data inadvertently. What is the most popular type of restaurant in America, in a sense? What kind of food do most people eat if number of restaurants is a reflection? I showed you the data. What do you think? Yes. Fast food is one, in fact, and it'll be fast food is one kind, but I'm looking at ethnic markers, right? Either it's nationally named or ethnic named. So fast food is a good way to think about it, and there are about, in some ways, 300,000. But other than fast food, what else would be the ethnic category? Most popular amongst Americans. Excellent. And you never saw this, did you? Italian, about 100,000 restaurants. By the way, these are self-definitions, okay? I don't go and look at them and quarrel with them. This is not real Italian food. If they call themselves Italian, right now I'm counting them as Italian, okay? And you will see that's interesting, how Italian food and Italian American food may or may not be the same thing, okay? And the other thing you will note there are about 16 million people of Italian heritage in the United States. I want you to keep that in mind as kind of a relationship. What is the next popular cuisine in the US? If we're going to we have fast food on one side, then we have Italian American food, then what do you think as an ethnic marker? You said Chinese? Excellent. Okay, Chinese American, which is about 50,000 restaurant, but look at the number of people, 5 million. Okay, and in fact, and here's back to your fast food question, there are more Chinese restaurants in the United States than fast food restaurants in the United States. So I would say Americans eat Chinese more than, American food taste is more Chinese than fast food. Okay, if we use that as a criteria of judgment. What comes after Chinese, you think? Excellent. Mexican. In fact, that number is going up. Okay, and look at the number of people, 35 million. I would say, look at Chinese. There are 50,000 restaurants. Mexican is also about 50,000 restaurants, and of 5 million Chinese people in the United States of Chinese heritage, there are 35 million people of Mexican heritage. You begin to see it is not a one-to-one relationship between number of people and the number of restaurants, because part of it is restaurants serve people inside the community. Often restaurants serve people outside the community. Okay, and we will see how kind of the cultural politics changes with that. By the way, every time you do something and you can identify something, what should also come into your mind is counterintuitive things. Okay, one of the things, there are more people of German heritage in the United States, and I don't know about you. Okay, it is very difficult to run into a German restaurant in the United States. Okay, you may have a Bavarian, like a beer garden or something, right? There are about 50 million Americans who are of German American heritage, but there are very few German restaurants. So here is almost the opposite. It's an intriguing question. Why? Though they dominate. If you drink beer in colleges, of course, I'm sure you're too young to drink beer. If you look at the names of your beers, American beers, they tend to have Germanic names. Okay, and in fact, in wine and beer, it's a kind of a peculiar part of the industry which is dominated by non-Anglo white ethnics, in fact, which is partly the relationship between the Puritanism, notions of prohibition, and especially this ethnic niche, white ethnic niche, and I'm going to talk a little about it. Then Indian American. For no good reason, I have Indian American material here. The only reason is because that's what I look like, and I work on Indian American material in terms of in great detail. And if you look at it, there are about 4,000 Indian restaurants, 4 million. Look at the Chinese and Indian, right? About the same number of people, but the difference is quite substantial in terms of the popularity. So this is one way of thinking about. Remember that question, Sydney Mintz, American cuisine. What is American cuisine? How do people name it? How do Americans name it? This is the first approximation about it. The second way of looking at it is what is called, in some ways, I would say, look at the talk. So here the first I counted restaurants. Okay. Second, I'm saying, okay, take a newspaper like the New York Times. Okay, what have they talked about? With digitization, it has become easier to think about it. The top 3 lines there are Italian, Chinese, and French. This is about, the good thing about the New York Times is that we have the longest running newspaper in New York City, which is where most of my work is based. So 170 years, okay? And if you look at that data, I just did search on restaurants, Italian restaurant, Italian food, Chinese restaurant, Chinese food, French restaurant, French food. The top 3 talked about are Italian, Chinese, and French. By the way, that's one side of it. Then on the other side, you look at the second, third, fourth cluster, you see German, continental, Korean, and Seoul. There's German there. Very small numbers, okay? Very large number of people, very little talk through the 170 years of the New York Times publication record. Then I want you to go back to the first 3, where you have Italian, Chinese, and French. A lot of the conversation about French is like, wow, French have terrific food. Our cuisine is not as good. We don't have a cuisine. By the way, that's not the same conversation with Italian and Chinese. So it is both popularity, but also a sense of unpopularity, discursive unpopularity. And I'll show you some of the conversations that's going on about Italian and Chinese food. By the way, until relatively recently, outsiders, non-Italians, thought Italians had very weird food. And I'll show you some very interesting quotes about it. I want to kind of hone back on this missing thing called German food. Okay, and why is it missing, and how have Americans characterized German food? This is a quotation from 1873, and it's on German restaurants in the New York Times. It says, they serve odd things that foreigners love, along with roasts, pumpkin pies, and dumplings that Americans prefer. For the Frenchmen, there is lentil soup in which masses of bologna sausage are floating, while the Irishman is vigorously to work on something like fish balls smothered in red cabbage, all of which is served with an enormous supply of coarse German bread. One customer orders a Wiener Schnitzel, a tremendous name, which, however, when brought, is only a veal cutlet with the bone removed. You see, people are beginning to familiarize themselves with some kind of interesting exotic food, and this is German food. Okay, by the way, one of the typical characteristics of so-called ethnic food is going to be cheapness. Okay, all this is for 15 cents. Further investigation into the mysteries of German cuisine shows beef a la mode served with macaroni, a very peculiar but highly satisfactory way of eating it, all served by waiters who are clearly German. I don't know about you. I can't figure out a clearly German guy from a regular white guy, but these people can figure it out. Okay, at this point of time, part of it is what you will learn in an anthropology class is body technique, habitus. Okay, what Marcel Mauss would say: how you move, how you walk. In fact, the way I use my hands reveals who I am in some ways. Okay, a solid white Anglo guy is not going to shake his hand the way I am shaking, okay? And these are ways in which our culture is embedded on our bodies. And in some ways, maybe they are figuring it out that who these Germans are. This mix of inviting exoticism and disdain continued into the first decades of the 20th century, Okay, and and so in some ways, one of my hypotheses, and if I get a little more time, I'm going to do more work on it, is that especially after 1945, German food gets hidden in plain view. That is, in fact, American food is really Germanic food, okay, with a different name. That itself is an interesting question. Why does that happen? And I'll show you maybe something you will see here. This is this what I showed you here is over the 170 years time period. Okay, I do this with the New York Times. I do this with every major newspaper. I'm just showing you so that you don't get bored. All the data. This is New York Times, and I fragment it over. I space it over time. I start with 1881 because the data is thin before that. I just want to draw your attention to one thing with the yellow. That's German. Okay, 1881 to say 1910. That's about about a 30-year period. Okay, and so German is most talked about in the New York Times, and then the next time period is 1911 to 1940. Look how it plummets, the talk about German food. Okay, what do you think is going on? What happened between 1911 and 1940? Two world wars. And were German our friends? No, right? So there was, you know what was surprising to me? I thought the Second World War would have a bigger impact, but really historically, the First World War has a massive impact because that is when the Germans were hounded. Okay? And the most important second language taught in American schools until the First World War was German. German is to American culture in some ways in 1914 what Spanish is to American culture today. And of course the irony is that's another American story. Yesterday's immigrant becomes today's nativists. Okay? And Germans in this case, it plummets the discussion. It plummets further. 1941, 1970, it almost vanishes out of view. Okay, and this is the time when a lot of, say, frankfurters are renamed as hot dogs. Okay, some of the naming changes, not everything changes, some of the naming changes. In that sense, it is in some ways what anthropologists are very good at studying, which is things that are hidden in plain view, obvious in the culture, taken for granted, but not named in some ways. And the German material you can also see in beer gardens. The one to your right is a picture of a beer garden. In many parts of New York City, there were lots of beer gardens, and it created a lot of hostility amongst Anglos because Anglo, especially Irish and the British, they have a segregated drinking culture in which men drink in pubs, which are public houses, very different from beer gardens where the Germans were drinking with their families and children. You have that man holding a child and women here. And so this was a lot of discussion in the New York Times, in the Chicago Tribune, is about weird German culture where men, women, and children are drinking together. Okay, so in some ways, what I'm trying to do here is historicize what looks like exotic, different culture. It changes over time. In this case, German culture. And the another way of looking at it is this is ancestry material, last names. If you look at most of the top three last names is Smith, Williams, Brown, Smith, Miller, Williams, all over Northeast, Midwest, to the west. In the south, you have Garcia, Smith, in Texas, Garcia, Smith, Martinez, Garcia, Chavez, and in California, Garcia, Hernandez, Lopez. One thing to note is the Anglophonity of the top names and then the Hispanic names at the bottom end of it. It'll be more interesting if you drill down to the top 10 names in terms of just numbers, okay? But one thing I want to draw your attention to, this is the analogy I'm making with German food. That German food is just American food with another name, is that just like Smith, in fact, in this naming list, hides Schmidt, okay? Miller hides Mueller, okay? And Becker hides Baker, okay? They have become, through the First World War and the Second World War, a lot of German families changed their last names to make them sound Anglophone and not foreign. The way Drumpf became Trump. okay, is in fact this process of shifting of Anglophonity, partly because of, in some ways, ostracization from outsiders. So we have the one attitude is towards German food. You saw this, okay, and hand in hand with it is going this kind of a bit of a hysteria. This is 1880, an octopus eaten by Chinaman. That's news, New York Times, okay, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Today, probably it'll be the opposite will be true, okay. People who don't eat octopus will be in the news, okay, and so this is kind of on Saturday last, some Chinese near etc. caught octopus and ate it, and this is the news in there. Or you'll have news like this, which has always been something that Americans have berated Chinese. Mott Street Chinamen angry, they deny that they eat rats. Okay, repeatedly in American history, okay, from 1850 onwards, the canard is going to be spread that Chinese eat really weird things, and this is also the time, by the way, folks are getting into Chinatowns to eat Chinese food. In fact, they are slumming, within quotation marks, in Chinatowns, often led by journalists who are also writing stories like this, okay? And so people who own restaurants in Chinatowns have to clarify as to what they are serving and what they are not serving, according to the prejudice of the time. In kind of at the end of the 19th century, there's this kind of a sense that restaurants and boarding houses are fast multiplying. People are not eating meals at home. By the way, the same kind of concern we have today, okay? That there's a certain kind of a threat to nationality and domesticity about it at that point of time. And anxieties about the domestic are typical in much of the commentary. By the way, if you do in the digitized databases a search for restaurants, in any of the major American newspapers, restaurant first show up in 1830. The word itself is easy to find because it's a French word. It is italicized. The word itself is born in France at the end of the 18th century, okay? But it comes to the U.S. in the first half of the 19th century. And the first time you find restaurants, it is always in association with crime and prostitution and criminality. It's clearly the part of the demi-monde, the underworld, that will eventually acquire its prestige, what we call high-end restaurants today. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit. There's another example I'll give you. Japanese food. Today, of course, many Americans think Japanese food is the height of culinary culture. The Michelin guide just came out. Other than French restaurants, the highest number of cuisines that are listed are in fact Japanese. Zagat's, if you look at it, if you look at menu pages, if you look at Yelp, the most highly rated restaurants are French, and I'll show you data on it, and then Japanese. But the funny thing is, most Americans did not think about that in terms of Japanese cuisine. And I'll give you one example. This is it's a beautiful study by a sociologist in Hawaii, Masuoka. He says, my children, this is quoting a Japanese immigrant in Hawaii. My children tell their mother what foods are good for our health. They say that we must eat vegetables and fruits, less rice. They learn this in American school. I do not interfere. I believe firmly that children should obey their teachers. There's a lot of pressure on Japanese kids in American schools to eat like Americans. A lot more meat, dairy products, so that they could become like white guys. There's kind of this idea that at this point of time that you become what you eat in this particular case, which was of course also a racialized notion of it. The Japanese case is also very intriguing because remember, we also put Japanese in internment camps in 1942. This is a picture from Manzanar where Japanese are interned, and you have kind of very explicit violent politics about Japanese, Chinese, and then Japanese, and then you of course end up with this idea that Japan is the capital of culinary culture. Americans today can't get enough of Japanese food. Okay, and in this particular case, Tokyo is thereby the unofficial culinary capital of the world, etc., etc. The point of all this is to historicize taste. My argument is this: no food is innately good, bad, attractive, or unattractive. What changes is our attitude to the people, okay, which is related to a matrix of class and race. Okay, and the moment in American history and how that changes. And Japanese example is a good one, and the Italian example is even more interesting. Okay, the Italian example is interesting because you have, in a sense, the largest amount of writing on Italian food is in the 1880s when most Italians are coming in. If many of you, how many of you are Italian heritage? Okay. And if you're of Italian heritage, it is highly likely that your ancestors came in to the US between 1880 and 1924. Okay. Largest number of Italians came after that. It petered out, and in fact, immigration was stopped. Any cuisine as coarse, overspiced, garlicky, and indelicate looking as the food of Eastern, Central Eastern, and Southern Europe must be unhealthy as well. And this was some of the work of the nutritionists and social scientists. Even some of the gourmands like James Beard in 1955, quite late, is writing, "My opinion of Italian cookery is not too high. It seems to me that even the food on the wagon-lit restaurant was better than all the food of Italy." And this is James Beard, who would become the founding father, so to say, of the birth of American cuisine. And then you flip in the other direction today. Today, of course, we cannot get enough of Italian food. Okay, the height of American food culture, in some ways, is Italian food culture, as this one quote shows from the Food Network in 2019. So what we have with the Italian one is kind of this rise, fall, and rise again. If we take a slightly longer view, in 1850s, we already see this, what would become eventually macaroni and cheese in American restaurants, which are slightly Frenchified as macaroni or parmesan, okay? And that would play an important role. Thomas Jefferson would make macaroni and cheese quite, in fact, as the height of culinary taste at the end of the 18th century. But eventually it will fall. Our estimate, American non-Italian outsiders' estimate of Italian food would change. And I'll show you one example from relationship within Italy itself. In one of the earliest references to Sicilian pizza, Carlo Lorenzini, and you have heard him as Collodi, who's the author of Pinocchio. He wrote in 1886. He comes from northern Italy. He's writing about Sicilian pizza. Okay, the blackened aspect of the toasted crust, the whitish sheen of garlic and anchovy, the greenish yellow tint of the oil and fried herbs, and those red bits of tomato here and there give pizza the appearance of complicated filth that matches the dirt of the vendor. Okay, this is in a sense how northern Italians looked at southern Italian food. Okay, this is what I call a hierarchy of taste. Okay, and you will see that changing as different groups of people come into the United States and they climb up and have upward mobility. And there's a lot of writing. By the way, immigrants write endlessly about food, and part of it is because immigrants are mostly working class immigrants coming in. They're after, in fact, the basic material aspects of life, in this case food. So in their letters they're writing extensively. Italians are writing about olive oil. By the way, most Americans were quite disgusted by olive oil until relatively recently. Okay, and pizza becomes kind of popular and in some ways gets kind of upgraded. So one of the things that happens, say, with Italian food or Irish food or English food or German food is a class elevation. Okay, and as Marcus Ravage, a Jewish immigrant in New York in 1900 noted, in New York every night was Friday night and every day was Saturday Sabbath as far as food went. Okay, because remember, most immigrants are coming in from low wage country to a high wage United States. That's why they come. It's always a flow from a relatively low wage to a high wage, and they can afford, in fact, food of their upper classes. And in this particular case, be it Italian American or East European, Polish American. This is a kind of a very interesting one, this whole question of how Italian is Italian American food question. Okay, a native of Palermo wrote in 1920s, one evening while strolling in New York, we went to an Italian restaurant where I was introduced to very fine traditional American specialties, called spaghetti and meatballs. And cotoletta parmigiana, I found both extremely satisfying, and I think someone in Italy should invent them for the Italians over there. Fascinating, right? Which is the circulation of concepts, like you would say, like now Japan has to reinvent California rolls since California rolls were invented in California. Okay, it circulates. There's this global circulation too, which is itself kind of fascinating. What I want to show you data next is, so I've looked at, in some ways, various newspapers. I do interviews with people. This one is from Zagat's, and why I'm after it is it gives me a price point for a meal. Until now, I haven't had any idea about what is the price of a meal. And Zagat's starts in 1979. Unfortunately, I went to Zagat's. They were not willing to give it to me because they didn't know what I was going to say. And so I had to find some places. And libraries mostly did not keep Zagat's because it's ephemera. They throw it away. No one takes a look at 1979 Zagat's so that they can eat in 1990 or 2019. So it gets thrown away. The earliest I could get was 1986 from the Library of Congress. The beautiful thing about Library of Congress is from your library, you can ask for interlibrary loan, they give it to you, and then I made a photocopy of it. Then the rest I bought from eBay, and then the more recent ones I bought directly. Okay, this gives me, for a sociologist, this is 30 years of data on price. I just want to draw your attention to a couple of things. This is 1986 to 2016. Remember, I was interested in popularity. I'm also interested in prestige. I'm using price as a surrogate for prestige. It's not an exact fit, but gives me some idea what are the most prestigious foods if we hold price as a surrogate for it. In 2016, I just want to draw your attention to, you see Japanese at the top, French up there, American, and especially if you call it New American, by the way, it goes up, the price of it, okay? Then you see continental, which by the way as a category is collapsing. Continental used to be, most of you probably don't know what continental is other than continental breakfast, which is a sad kind of a representation of basically baked goods, which is continental was an American imagination idea of the food of expensive European hotels. Okay, at one point of time. Now they exist as retro. Then you have Italian. Italian is funny in this data set because the price of Italian and prestige of Italian food is going up. I'm going to show you more data on it. In this case, it looks like it is falling a little. That is related, remember when I showed you Italian restaurants, 100,000 restaurants, out of which 60,000 are pizzerias. The price of a slice of pizza and a pizza pie even is cheaper than, say, a white tablecloth Italian restaurant. If I separated them, the price of Italian also goes up. By the way, the fastest rising ones are Spanish, Greek, and Korean. Okay, in terms of price, I'll show you other data. And Vietnamese is kind of swinging upwards. Mexican is climbing. Indian is kind of stable and kind of falling. Chinese, Southern, Thai. Just to keep that in mind, I'll come back to some of this. The fastest rising are at the top, Greek and Korean. And I've highlighted Japanese and Chinese there because part of the question is it is a bit about race, but it's a lot about class too. If you just take race without taking class into consideration, you won't have a more robust theory of, in this case, of hierarchy of taste, in my estimation. I show it by looking at data on price of meals. This is the next one is, so I've shown you Zagat's. This is Yelp data. Couple of things. This is New York City. From the top to bottom is popularity. When New Yorkers go out to eat, they go out to eat Italian food most of the time. Okay? Then Chinese. Then Mexican, then soul food. In terms of popularity, Japanese, New American, the bottom one is Moroccan, which is enough numbers so I can count here. Of course, there are other categories, much smaller categories where percentage doesn't look that good. Okay? So this is the listing of popularity. Anything surprises you there? Italian, Chinese, Mexican? In fact, I didn't realize soul food would be doing so well in popularity. Okay? And then Japanese. That's one thing to note. The second thing to note is I use Yelp's filters of pricey, moderate, and expensive to look at. Remember, I'm interested in price and pricey as prestige, right? Surrogate for prestige. That's the green bit. Okay? So about 12% of Italian restaurants in New York City are upscale. Only 2% of Chinese restaurants are upscale. And by the way, that's changing. That's going to change. Okay? My hypothesis is we are going to get more expensive Chinese food soon. And we are already getting it for interesting reasons. And the reasons, one of the reasons is the end of the immigration of poor working class immigrants, the rise of China as a major economic power and also a soft power, okay? And our universities, the university I come from, NYU, has a lot of Chinese students who are kids of professionals, and there are all these Taiwanese bubble tea shops all around NYU campus. That has become kind of the new thing, very popular with kids, college kids. So, but the number there, only 2% of Chinese restaurants are upscale in New York. Mexican 6%. I was in fact a bit surprised by that number. I thought that was better than what I had expected. New York City has in fact seen a growth of upscale Mexican restaurants lately, much later than LA, much later than Chicago. Okay, don't believe New Yorkers who say that they're always in the forefront of things. People who live in Manhattan think they're always in the forefront. They're usually, in fact, behind in a lot of trends. Part of it is because real estate is very expensive in Manhattan. Then Seoul, I was surprised how good. 10% of Seoul restaurants are upscale restaurants. And these are in some ways showing up, and this is relatively recent. This looks quite different from your Zagat's data because Zagat's is more middlebrow, middle class, professional, founded by lawyers. This is more leading edge data in some ways. Okay. The downside of this data is I cannot go back 30 years with Yelp data. Yelp did not exist. That's why I use Zagat's data. I'm keeping track of this data and I'm going to look at it ahead. But right now, if you look at Japanese, I was a little surprised that only 8% of Japanese restaurants are upscale. And that is partly because, in fact, remember your Zagat's data, it showed how most expensive restaurants in New York City are Japanese, but a lot of cheap Japanese sushi places have emerged, which, by the way, are run not by Japanese but by Chinese. Okay, there's a very interesting ethnic succession there. Just like a lot of French restaurants in New York City for the longest time were run by Italians. Okay, outsiders couldn't differentiate, couldn't tell the difference, and in fact you could make more money running French restaurants and running Japanese restaurants than you're running Chinese restaurants or Italian restaurants. And then it goes down like Southern does much better, etc., etc. But you look at French, it is also the highest. 27% of French restaurants are the upscale restaurants. After that, it's New American. And then you have, by the way, Moroccan, which is very interesting, because Moroccan is partly tagging French. There would be a French restaurant, they'll have a tagine, they'll give it a Moroccan name or identifier, and in some ways it'll come identified as Moroccan, okay? So, and then you see Peruvian, etc. This is New York City data. And I want to show you, I've done this to every city, I won't bore the heck out of you. I just want to show you LA. What changes in LA do you think when you look at this data in terms of popularity? What goes up in popularity? Remember, the y-axis is popularity counted from the top down. Oops. You saw this? Note the top 3 or 4. Predictably, this is LA. Mexican moves up in terms of popularity, right? But Italian, Chinese, everything else almost stays the same. French moves up. The other thing is about 3%. I was surprised by that number, that only 3% of Mexican restaurants in LA are upscale. Okay, but Mexican is like Italian too. You can also have a cheap taco place. You can have a terrific taco place, but it won't be as expensive. So the data has to be in some ways differentiated. But the most prestigious, remember, it's the green point, right? Which is American, New American, and then you have, what's next after that? Southern, which is quite for me was a bit of a surprise. And then you have French, and then say what? Italian, Spanish, etc. Oh, by the way, one thing I forgot to show you here is kind of the New York City data. Just look at Arab. Okay, it is about what, 10th or so on the popularity. Arab. Okay, then you see Arab, French, Greek, Vietnamese. Look at Israeli. So if you sell the same food, you call it Arab, you have to run an inexpensive place. You sell the same food, you call it Israeli, 14% of your restaurants are upscale. This is what I mean by hierarchy of taste. That's my big theory. Okay? It has very little to do with food. It has a lot to do with our expectation of the association with the people, the class, race. And these are, by the way, class and race are social constructs of as to what they mean. I'll just give you one other thing, and I'll stop and open it up to your questions. Okay? This was LA. And of course, I remember I'm trying to say about American hierarchy of taste, certain kinds of urbanization and certain kinds in different cities. You can do this. I have lots of city data. And if you're interested in this, I can send it to you. Send me an email. I'll send it to you. I wanted to look at London because I wanted to see what does a non-American city, does it look very different from an American city in terms of hierarchy of taste? Okay? This is also Yelp. Okay, you can do it with Yelp, you can do it with Zagat's, you can do it, you get a little more kind of a longitudinal data, Michelin, which is relatively recent. You see what goes up there? Number one, in terms of popularity, what is it? Indian, right? That's not a surprise, okay? It's kind of, it was predictable. And look at the number of Indian restaurants that are upscale in London, 12%. The number of Indian restaurants that are upscale in New York is 2%. There are very few groups that cross the 2% barrier in New York City, okay? And in some ways, there will be Italian, French, New American on the other side, Japanese, okay? Then there will be some like Moroccan, etc. And then the bottom end of Thai, Vietnamese, Indian, etc. would be at 2%. So here it's 12%. In a sense, my hypothesis is this. What Italian is to American food, Indian is to English food. People go out to eat. When they go out to eat in London, they go out to eat Indian food, and it's in a wide spectrum, okay? And including mid-market, upscale, and down-market. The other thing you see here is, of course, the continuing prestige of French. Almost half of French restaurants in London are very upscale. Okay, so there is a hierarchy of taste here. The other thing you should note is a lot more restaurants are upscale in London than in New York. Partly because it costs more to eat out in London than in New York City. Partly because labor costs are more. Because you have to pay basically much higher wage rates in London because it includes things like healthcare. That it does not include healthcare, time off from work, etc. Okay? So there's a hierarchy of taste linked to it. So my big points is this. Popularity and prestige of cuisines are not randomized. They exhibit patterns. There's a hierarchy of taste, and that hierarchy changes over time, which is kind of fun to work on. Okay? And each one of you can do that since the newspapers have all been digitized now. It's a fantastic research project, especially on things that are missing and things that are invisible, like, say, Irish food. Why the heck don't we talk about Irish food at all? I mean, and now we are discovering how good Irish food can be, like Irish butter, cream, forced meats, etc. Okay, but there's a sense in which we do not talk about certain people's foods, and we in fact talk about other people's food. So there's a hierarchy of taste, and that taste changes over time. Some, such as German and Irish, are hidden in plain view as American cuisine of Northern Europe. In some ways, the cuisines, I would say, the butter-olive oil divide in terms of a line. In Europe, a line runs right through the middle of it. Along the Mediterranean is the olive oil line, which is relatively recent, post 1880s, 1920s, and the prestige of Italian food, in fact, goes up in the United States very recently, about the 1970s. Okay, and that is linked to the fact that Italians move up and out of primarily working class professions, occupations, into city halls, sports, movie stars are Italian. So our assessment of Italian cuisine changes as the class structure of the Italian group changes in American history. And that happens with different kinds of groups. The hierarchy, in fact, is different in different cities. So if you look at Chicago, if you look at LA, if you look at Seattle, if you look at Vancouver, for instance, if you cross the border, and if you look at Vancouver, Chinese food does differently simply because of the role of Chinese immigrants and the nature of Chinese immigrants into Vancouver. Yet there are some national and some regional patterns. And I have argued elsewhere, and if you don't want to read my long, boring book, read a piece in The Atlantic that came out, which is a summary of my argument, which in fact, the title they gave is "The Future is Expensive Chinese Food." And I argue this is my synthesis of all this analysis that I've done with the historical sociological material to say that the end of in-migration of poor Chinese after the takeoff of the Chinese economy, which has been going on for a while, unless there's a catastrophic crisis, and the rise of power of Chinese economy and prestige soft power is pushing Chinese cuisine upwards in the American estimation of taste. So in a sense, it is linked to what we think of a culture, especially outsiders. These are all outsiders' assessment, by the way, okay, in most cases. The insiders' assessments are different. So in closing, I would say a couple of things, big things, okay? We are right in the middle. I'm a sociologist. I make big, broad generalizations that you shouldn't do as an anthropologist. It's a third great transformation in American taste since, I would say, 1965. We have about 60 million people who have come into the United States from Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, adding a vast range like avocados, cilantro, chili. Chili, of course, is ironic because chili is of the New World, but we have come to discover them through more recent immigrants, especially specifically from Latin America. Mangoes, jicama, curries, moles, noodles, tacos, soy, and sushi. And American food culture has become quite a dynamic, disruptive, agile domain, I think analogous to what happened to popular music even before 1980s. The interesting question is how cultural change happens in these various domains, and how in some domains, like I'll give you this an example, a parenthetical example, there's wide acknowledgement of strong presence of African American in American music culture, but relatively understated in American food culture. So the interesting question is, why is that? Okay, of course, a part of it is racism, but racism should also operate in the domain of music. Why does it operate in a particular way there and not in food? In fact, I haven't yet read a good theory, maybe you're familiar with it, as to why this difference in terms of way different communities. But remember, my work is primarily not among African Americans. My work is primarily amongst immigrants, and that's not my domain of expertise. But that's kind of, it raises broader, interesting question between culture and between power and material culture, and in this case, pleasure and social hierarchy, music, food, things about taste. In a sense, I would say, this is kind of a hypothesis, is very few cultures, Argentinian culture comes to mind, is comparable in absorbing alien influences in reshaping America itself as American culture. My argument is American cuisine changes about every 40 years, and that's a good thing. And because such a transformation is a sign of economic and cultural integration of migrant populations. This is my link to my larger argument about mobility and culture. We often think of culture as roots. Okay, I think of culture as roots, but also as routes of mobility. Okay, human beings have found homes, and human beings have always moved. Okay, and what we call food culture, in fact, reflects both, in some ways, stability, the finding of home and rootedness, but also equally of mobility, transformation, and change. Okay, so let me end there and maybe open it up to some questions about this whole question of material culture, power, and taste. Thank you. questions, thoughts, comments? Get to the mic, yep. I hope you're not afraid of being filmed. I saw a hand up there. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead, please.
Food or culture, because you didn't mention about that.
Yeah. Part of it is, and remember, I'm classifying it what I call nominalism. If Americans are classifying it, I can find the data. With the Eastern European one, it gets distributed amongst many ethnicities and names and numbers. Polish is one of them that shows up, but the numbers are relatively small. So I have very little data on it. It is usually, and that's one of the downsides of looking at, in some ways, this nominalist argument of looking at the way Americans are naming it. Often Eastern European food in places like New York gets turned into Jewish food. Okay, and that is partly, of course, the relationship between the nature of the migrants who are coming in, like bagel and cream cheese, right? Which can be Turkish food up to Polish food in some ways. So yes, that's a missing problem with my data, that I don't have enough material to talk about it. Good point. Now you can go to the mic. Want to go ahead?
I wanted to ask about like the absence of not just like African American but black ethnic food like Afro-Caribbean or like those type of foods.
Excellent point. It is about, the problem is, again, the same as Eastern European. Americans are not naming it at numbers that I can find in these, like Zagat's does not almost, other than African cuisines, like it will be Moroccan, Algerian, and Ethiopian. Ethiopian does very well in say Washington D.C. market. If I showed you data, let me see if I have data. It will be the some of the African cuisine. So here is, you see the best. Here I include all the cuisines, including all those that are named. If you look from the top there, French, you can see Algerian, Moroccan, South African. Okay, but the numbers, why I didn't show it in the other data, is the numbers are relatively small. Okay, this is if I include everything, and if you look on that list, South African, and then you go down, you almost have to then Ethiopian. Ethiopian does very well in the mid-market range, and especially in cities like Washington D.C. Okay, compared to New York City. New York City is a relatively weak city for, let me put it like this, upscale African cuisines. If you go to San Francisco, Moroccan does astonishingly well. Okay, and then if you go down further, you see Somali, Nigerian, and then Senegalese at the end of it. Okay, so excellent question. This is, I have included all the Yelp categories that show up in any number. Remember, this is my last, this one was anything above 250 hits on Yelp. Okay, the African cuisines don't get up to 250 hits. That's why they don't show up in this data, but they show up here. I include all of it, hence it shows up. Excellent question. Other thoughts, comments?
I guess going based off of her question, my question would be how you classify Southern food versus soul food, because I feel like they could be very interchanged. And then you had a graph earlier that you didn't really mention, but there was a huge spike in Southern food. If you want to go back to
Yes, exactly.
Sorry.
Yeah. Let's see.
Nope.
Um,
That one. No.
the fall or
No,
this one?
No,
this
you're
one.
right. Not the other one.
The other one?
Yes. Okay. So
Fantastic. It's a fall in this case.
Oh, it's a
Remember, this
fall.
is prestige. Remember, this is catastrophic decline. But it's a
Okay.
good question. You know why? Because I think this data is really bad and thin. This is Zagat's. In fact, they are totally confused how to classify that food. Sometimes they call it soul, sometimes they call it southern. Remember, I am just naming it, whatever it is named. I'm not getting into it and saying, so what's the difference between Southern and Seoul, okay? And in this case, it catastrophically declines, and look how different it will become when you look at Yelp data. Yelp Southern will do a lot better if you look at this one, right? This is I think what you're pointing to. You see Italian, Chinese, Mexican, and then Seoul there, and then you will have Southern, okay? And good question. I don't make the distinction. If they call themselves Seoul, I count it in Seoul. In fact, a lot of the restaurants count themselves as Seoul and Southern. So I'll count them on both Seoul and Southern. But good question. And that's the more substantive one. If you, that is the deeper data you have to get into, right? That's thick description. What distinctions do people make? And by the way, how that relationship changes over time. It's not a stagnant relationship, right? As some people have called, what's the difference between soul food and Southern food, and what are the similarities? Excellent question. Other thoughts? Yes.
How would you categorize vegan and vegetarian food?
Yeah, so yes, I don't have, maybe the next time I look at it, I have not looked at it. Remember, I'm looking at ethno-national markers, okay? So I have not looked at vegan, just as I have not looked at fast food, technically, in any of this data. So, future study.
I think that
Vegan.
kind of goes under New American.
Often, sometimes on the New American. If they call themselves New American, it shows up in the New American data. If they don't call themselves New American, if they call themselves just vegan, it doesn't show up in the data. Come on, come up to the mic.
Hi, so would you interpret fusion restaurants as like minorities teaming up?
Good, good. It's a very interesting thing. Fusion is a terrific category. Two things about it. I would say everyone is doing fusion, but fusion has, for some reason, at the upper end of the market has become a bad word. Okay? So people are doing fusion, but not acknowledging it. And that's where you need this thing hidden in plain view. So you will often have a soy or mirin based, like a pickled fish dish with a slice of jalapeno on top of it, okay? Served in a New American restaurant. Or you will have polipeti or octopus on Punjabi chickpea, okay, with chickpea with garam masala, okay? That's happening in upscale restaurants, but they are often calling, if it's upscale, they're calling themselves New American. So you're absolutely right. So kind of when fusion moves up, and in some ways you call it New American, you call it kind of in some ways global, but global doesn't have a good reputation in food. People, presumably, people want food from a place, looks like, right now, okay? And they don't want, like there was a lot of discussion at one point of time, is fusion confusion, okay? That you're pulling in too many things. But these are how names, by the way, it has happened with art and painting too, how things get named. And especially, I would say, upscale American restaurants are basically Japanese American Italian restaurants, basically. And it's a mix of these things that are getting played at the higher end of it. At the bottom end of it, and this is a very interesting question, because there are two kinds of authenticity American audience expect. At the higher end of the marketplace, they expect the signature of the artist, in this case, a chef. Okay, artist or a craftsman is usually a man still, okay? Some women. But at the bottom end of the market, they're expecting ethnic authenticity. So one of the markers of ethnic authenticity is this: if it is expensive, if it's Mexican food, it can be authentic Mexican food, okay? Which is a funny burden that we have in terms of a hierarchy of taste. Or if it's expensive and it's Indian, it can be authentically Indian, because authentic Indian has to be cheap, because it has to be related to, in some ways, the food and the cooking of the poor migrants. So there's different ways in which different parts of the field, how authenticity works. And at the upper end of the field, it's more seen as a signature of the person, and at the lower end of the field, it is seen as a signature of a community. Okay, more that it belongs to the commons. There's some interesting theorization to do, and some of your professors are going, I think, doing that theorization in their next books. Other thoughts? You can also speculate about it.
Do you think the incorporation of Italian and German food has some relation to the expansion of white as a category?
Excellent point. It's a beautiful point. In some ways, we think, in a sense, we think white is natural, just we think black is natural. In fact, white is a totally changing category, okay? And in fact, by the way, according to American census, that's a lovely analysis to do. You should just look at the census data every 10 years, how the classification of race changes. Somebody like me, right? I'm blacker than most of my black friends, okay? But I'm not considered black. Okay, I'm considered, for instance, in the earliest American classification, I was considered a Hindu. Even though if I was a Muslim or a Sikh, in fact, most people classified as Hindu were Sikhs in California. So this is this classification thing, and white is a funny classification that changes. Ben Franklin was whining a lot in Philadelphia because he was surrounded by the Germans, and he thought the Germans were swarthy and not white enough. Okay, they had a different language. So Germans become white, in fact, in the course of the Civil War, just as the Irish become white. Irish were not considered white. They're considered a different class of people who couldn't be white people. Okay, so white is partly the social classification of color, class, and race. In fact, and you're absolutely right, the rise of Italian food, in some ways, the invisibility of German and Irish food is their dissolving into whiteness, okay? And the rise of Italian food is their emergence. In my book, I call it white but not quite, okay? Is Italian food. It has the thing about, it has some ethnic markers about it that is not quite fully white, okay? But kind of white. By the way, that's happening right now with Jewish identity and Jewish food. There's a way in which people have argued, even written a book called How Jews Become White. Okay? And in South Africa, by the way, under apartheid, Japanese were considered honorary whites. You see, and that is because of the power of the Japanese state and the cultural power of it. And you see the rise of Japan is, in a sense, in this case, I would say, most crudely, culture, unfortunately, seems to follow capital and the symbolic power, violence of capital. In this case, people who climb up become some things. And this is a terrific example of looking at how these groups are culturally constructed and prestige of their material culture changes in different points of time in American history. Excellent question. Yes, please.
You pointed to the, you made a prediction about Chinese food
Yes.
becoming more and more central in the upscale prestige markets. And I was interested to know if your data shows any correlation between how upgradation of class and race might be different for European immigrants versus non-European immigrants.
Yeah, excellent point. I don't think it is going to be that easy for the Chinese to become white. Okay? Part of it is because of the long history of the racial difference between the two. They will become whitish. Okay? And in some ways, and so you're absolutely right, it takes much longer for these other kind of categories of people to enter into elite culture. But on the other side of it, remember also the nature of capitalism itself is changing, and things we associate with the power of capital is also changing. Capital looks a lot more Asian today, and it's going to look a lot more Asian in the next 50 years in most of your lifetime. It is going to be a lot more Pacific Rim capitalism rather than Atlantic white capitalism. Okay? And so there is an interesting relationship of, there is a slow movement of upward mobility, but not easy as those who can dissolve into whiteness and those who cannot. Excellent point. Yes, please. They want you at the mic. London Yelp, okay. Number, yeah, good, yes.
I'm very interested in this. You had said that prestige follows capital. London is a hugely dynamic city where one of the major centers of finance. And I'm just going on your observations about how American cuisine is extremely vibrant, dynamic, inclusive, a distillation of all sorts of tastes. I wondered if you would care to comment on the fact that American cuisine has preference there in London.
That's excellent point. London is the only market in which anything called American, other than New American, by the way, does very well. New American also does very well. So here I'm going to contradict myself now because your question is so good. It's, in some case, there's a relationship between capital, power, and culture, but that is not always a one-to-one relationship. And here's the funny thing, if you look at, I'll give you an example. You can be number one in capital and military power, but you may not be in cultural power sometimes. And a very good example is the place I come from. The British were number one, but in India, no one eats British food. We drink British drinks, okay? Whiskey and tea. Tea, by the way, is a totally British invention, okay? Of course, it has become totally naturalized. Most Indians think it is the most Indian thing to do in the world. Gandhi was berating Indians for drinking too much tea and getting addicted to tea, and the British were selling it. The British made most of the money out of the tea. The funny thing is, and what you pose is this, some dominant political cultures seem to work in the domain of food, some don't. The French work in the domain of food and drinks, okay? And you see the difference, the relationship of French colonies, the France, and North Africa, for instance. But that doesn't work with the Anglo-British imperialisms, okay? They don't dominate by good taste. Maybe they dominate by bad taste. Okay, there's a funny relationship where, so it's not just a one-to-one correlationship, but some forms of power go with culture, some forms of cultural power, not with others. But for instance, Indians don't eat British food, they drink whiskey and tea, and they do read English novels. Okay, and in fact, you see on the other side, the impact of Indians on English novels is like the impact of curry on British taste. So in some ways, it is how the empire strikes back sometimes. Yes, go ahead. Go ahead up there. They need you up there at the...
So, New American food is like... Is that like the stuff that they always make fun of for being like really expensive, but there's like barely anything on the
Absolutely, that's exactly what it is. It is the more prestigious of food, the less you have it.
Okay. And then would you say, you made like a small thing on this, but I don't know because it's not that big of a topic, but with a lot of the separation of Italia, what is it called, that Southern Italian food and Northern Italian food have kind of switched places over the years?
Excellent point. Lovely. Smart guy. So in some ways what happens is, if you look in detail into the data, initially the Italian restaurants, the upscale Italian restaurants are all northern. Okay, they're claiming northern identity, saying that is south. We don't go south of basically Rome. Okay? And then what happens is, by about 1980s, restaurants, Italian restaurants in New York City start naming themselves as Southern or Northern. Okay, say Ossobuco or say pizza, pasta. Okay, in some ways with say arrabbiata sauce, right? It's of course an Arab influenced sauce. Okay, spiciness of it, and you begin to see this where Northern Italian restaurants are the expensive one and the Southern Italian are the cheap ones. Until in any fashion direction, what happens is, until, say in this case, one of those guys, he starts playing with upscale Southern Italian food. And that also starts moving up. So it goes back and forth between this. But Northern Italian food is always the more prestigious one, and Southern Italian is the more subaltern one. And that changes over time, and it changes in the marketplace. And by the way, this is all outsider evaluations. Inside the community is different kind of evaluations. And one of the things, thankfully, by the way, American reformers berated Italians for eating their food and called it garlicky, spicy, made them thirsty for alcohol. That's why they're drinking all that wine. And remember, that got associated with prohibition in the United States. And prohibition was largely, very strongly a white female movement, Anglo movement, okay, against this ethnic hordes of Italians coming in with their bad taste. Okay, and that, of course, I mean, that's kind of astonishing to think about. By 1980s, that totally flips. We think the Italians have the best food in the world, their wines are fantastic, and everybody now buys different kinds. If you have ever walked into a grocery store, the number of olive oils you see is crazy. Okay, and so that has totally flipped, and that is interesting how it happens to some cuisines, how it does not happen to other cuisines, and how some cuisines like the German and the Irish vanish into the whiteness, while Italians in fact do not vanish into whiteness. They kind a different kind of whiteness, which is much more gustatorily kind of developed or articulated. And Hasia Diner has written a beautiful book. She has compared Italian immigrants, Jewish immigrants, and Italian, Jewish, and Irish immigrants. And the question about Eastern European food gets accommodated there. She shows, and she's looking at it from the opposite direction. She's looking at letter writing within these communities. What are they saying about their food? She says Italians, in fact, endlessly talk about how great their food is. They are never bullied by their food, okay? And they throw back disdain towards elite culture, saying you guys basically don't have a good palate, don't know how to do it. Some cultures have that resilience and a capacity to push back against dominant norms, okay? And almost every culture, if it is about religion, by the way, Americans, as they migrate, they change their language, they change their attire, they never change their religion, or rarely change their religion, okay? Some groups change their foods faster than other groups. And Italian is one of the group that is quite resistant. Part of it is linked to, in some ways, the internal discursive power of Italian food and also the demographic weight. Remember, we're talking about 16 million people compared to, say, 4 million Indians. Okay, and 4 million Indians distributed across. There are no India towns. There are some India towns in some ways, but there are more little Italies. So little Italies are also a place of a certain kind of a resilience, like Chinatowns are for inside the community. So it's an interesting relationship between community, group, power, and which cultural domain in which they in fact are much more resilient than in others. Excellent question. Yes. No, go ahead, yes, yeah.
Okay, so you talk about how German and Irish cuisine absorb into whiteness, which like makes complete sense, but in the graph from like 1870 or 1880 in the New York Times, I don't think Irish food is mentioned like at all.
Yeah.
So is there any, do you think there's any particular reason for that? Because I mean, even now you see a ton of like Irish pubs, but like it's not really someplace that a lot of people go.
Good
I was
question.
Yeah.
Good question. I don't have an answer. I don't know whether I even looked at Irish in this particular case. I might have to do that work because that's. I was talking to your professors. Once I get my sabbatical, I want to look into this hidden thing of German and Irishness. Okay, and the distinctions between the two would be quite interesting and important. I haven't had time to do that. I think in this, I don't even count Irish. It tells you, because in my head, it was not in my head. I was looking at the German case and make the German stand in for the Irish case. That may not be true. So I'll have to, that's what you found is a gap in my argument, which is an important gap that I have to work on. New data, and I'll come back to you with a response in 6 months.